Before longships appeared on the horizons of distant kingdoms, before monks hurried to hide their precious manuscripts at the sound of approaching oars, and before the word Viking entered into the chronicles of Europe, the people of Scandinavia lived in a world shaped by forests, mountains, and the sea. The Viking Age did not emerge suddenly in the late 8th century. It was the product of generations of gradual change, rooted in the landscape of Northern Europe and in the communities that learned to thrive within it. And so, to understand the Vikings, it helps to begin with the land itself. Scandinavia occupies the northern reaches of Europe, stretching from the Danish peninsula through the rugged mountains of Norway and across the broad forests and lakes of Sweden. Even today, it is a region defined by dramatic geography. Deep fjords carve into Norway's western coast, their steep cliffs rising sharply from cold waters, carried inland by ancient glaciers. Sweden's interior is covered by dense forests, broken by thousands of lakes, while Denmark lies lower and gentler, its fertile fields facing both the North Sea and the Baltic. This geography shaped nearly every aspect of life. Much of Scandinavia possessed relatively little land suitable for large-scale farming. Mountain ranges divided communities from one another, and thick forests made overland travel difficult for much of the year. Rivers flowed swiftly toward the sea, while coastlines stretched for thousands of miles, filled with sheltered coves, islands, and natural harbors. For many communities, traveling by water was easier than traveling across land. The sea was not viewed as a barrier separating settlements. Rather, it was the road connecting them. This relationship with water would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of Viking civilization, though it had much older roots. For centuries before the Viking Age began, Scandinavian peoples had already developed considerable skill as sailors, fishermen, and coastal traders. Boats allowed neighboring settlements to exchange goods and travel between regions that otherwise remained isolated by difficult terrain. Climate also influenced the rhythm of life. Winters were long and dark, particularly in Norway and Sweden, where snow could blanket the countryside for months. Summers, by contrast, were filled with remarkably long days. During the growing season, families worked intensely to raise crops, gather hay, repair buildings, and prepare supplies that would carry them through the colder months. Survival depended upon careful planning and cooperation. The inhabitants of Scandinavia belonged to the wider family of Germanic peoples who occupied much of northern Europe during antiquity. They shared related languages, similar religious traditions, and many social customs with communities living farther south around the North Sea. Yet Scandinavia remained somewhat removed from the centers of Roman civilization, as the Roman Empire never conquered Scandinavia. Roman merchants certainly visited northern Europe, and Roman luxury goods occasionally found their way into Scandinavian settlements through trade. Archaeologists have uncovered Roman glassware, coins, jewelry, and finely crafted metal objects buried hundreds of miles beyond the empire's borders. Such discoveries reveal that northern communities were not isolated from the wider world. They participated in exchange networks that stretched across Europe, even if Roman armies never marched among their forests. These contacts brought more than imported goods. As with many growing civilizations, they also introduced new ideas, technologies, and prestige objects that ambitious local leaders used to strengthen their own influence. When the Western Roman Empire gradually collapsed during the 5th century, Europe entered a period of political transformation known as the Migration Period. Across much of the continent, Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman administration. Goths, Franks, Lombards, Angles, Saxons, and many other peoples established new realms upon the foundations of imperial provinces. Scandinavia was not untouched by these developments. Although the Great Migrations largely unfolded beyond its borders, the movement of peoples altered trade routes and political relationships throughout Northern Europe. Warriors returned home carrying foreign weapons, unfamiliar artistic styles, and stories of distant kingdoms. Trade shifted toward emerging powers around the North Sea, creating new opportunities for Scandinavian elites. The centuries following Rome's decline witnessed important changes within Scandinavia itself. Historians often refer to roughly the 6th through 8th centuries as the Vinland Age, named after richly furnished graves discovered near the Swedish village of Vinland. These remarkable burials contain beautifully decorated helmets, swords, shields, horse equipment, and jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. Their contents reveal a society that had become increasingly wealthy and socially stratified. Power rested largely with regional chieftains and petty kings. Rather than unified kingdoms, Scandinavia consisted of numerous local polities. A single valley might acknowledge one ruler, while the neighboring fjord followed another. Alliances shifted through marriage, diplomacy, trade, and warfare. Loyalty centered upon individuals rather than abstract states. Successful leaders rewarded followers with gifts, protection, and opportunities for wealth, while followers offered military service and political support in return. Prestige mattered enormously. A leader's reputation depended not only upon success in battle, but also upon generosity. Gift-giving reinforced personal bonds throughout society. Swords, arm rings, finely crafted brooches, imported glass, and silver ornaments all served as visible symbols of status. Wealth was valuable, but distributing wealth wisely could prove even more important than possessing it. Archaeological discoveries suggest that competition among these local rulers intensified during the centuries before the Viking Age. Larger halls appeared across southern Scandinavia, serving as political centers where leaders hosted feasts, resolved disputes, organized military expeditions, and demonstrated their authority. These halls stood at the heart of community life. Within their timber walls, alliances were forged over shared meals. Marriages were negotiated. Poets recited heroic traditions, and disputes found settlement through discussion or compensation. Oral history flourished in these gatherings. Tales of legendary ancestors and celebrated warriors helped reinforce both family identity and political legitimacy. Religion also occupied a central place within society. The Scandinavian peoples practiced a form of Germanic paganism, whose beliefs evolved over centuries. Much of what modern historians know comes from later medieval Icelandic texts, archaeological evidence, place names, and occasional descriptions written by foreign observers. Because many written accounts were recorded after Scandinavia had converted to Christianity, scholars exercise caution when reconstructing earlier religious practice. Certain elements, however, appear well established. Communities believed the world to be inhabited by powerful supernatural beings who influenced harvests, fertility, weather, and victory in battle. Sacred groves, springs, lakes, and prominent trees often served as places of worship. Offerings of weapons, jewelry, animals, and occasionally human lives were deposited in bogs and wetlands, perhaps as gifts to divine powers. Among the gods later described in Norse tradition were Odin, associated with wisdom, kingship, poetry, and war; Thor, protector of both gods and humanity, whose hammer symbolized strength and order; and Freyr, closely connected with fertility, prosperity, and successful harvests. Religion was woven naturally into daily existence rather than separated from it. Seasonal festivals marked important moments in the agricultural calendar. Sacrifices sought favorable weather, abundant crops, healthy livestock, and success in warfare. Religious practice strengthened community identity while reinforcing the authority of local leaders who often presided over important ceremonies. Even burial customs reflected changing ideas about status and belief. Some individuals were cremated upon funeral pyres, while others were buried intact beneath earthen mounds. Wealthier graves might include weapons, tools, jewelry, horses, boats, or household goods intended to accompany the deceased into the next life. The famous ship burials, uncovered at sites such as Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway, date slightly later than the beginning of the Viking Age. Yet they continue traditions already developing during the Vinland period, illustrating the symbolic importance of ships long before overseas expansion reached its height. Economic life rested upon a careful balance between farming, animal husbandry, fishing, hunting, and local craftsmanship. Most families cultivated barley, rye, oats, and other hardy crops suited to northern climates. Cattle provided milk, while sheep supplied wool for clothing. Goats thrived on rough grazing land, pigs consumed forest forage, and chickens appeared around many settlements. Fishing contributed significantly to coastal diets, supplemented by seals, whales that occasionally washed ashore, and game taken from surrounding forests. But few households could produce everything they required. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons. Skilled woodworkers constructed houses, wagons, sledges, and boats. Women played essential roles in spinning wool, weaving cloth, preparing food, and managing many aspects of household production. Specialized craftsmen created jewelry, carved bone and antler, and decorated everyday objects with intricate animal designs that would eventually become one of the defining artistic traditions of Viking Scandinavia. Trade gradually expanded throughout these centuries. Amber from the Baltic coast remained a prized luxury across Europe. High-quality furs, walrus ivory from the far north, soapstone, whetstones, iron, and slaves all entered regional exchange networks. Silver became the preferred medium for storing wealth, though barter continued alongside precious metals. Small market settlements began to appear in favorable locations, where traders from different regions gathered seasonally. These early commercial centers laid the foundations for the larger trading towns that would flourish during the Viking Age itself. But as wealth accumulated, competition naturally followed. Historians continue to debate exactly why Scandinavian expansion accelerated during the late 8th century. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation. Instead, most scholars point toward several developments that reinforced one another over generations. Population growth may have placed greater pressure upon available farmland in some regions, encouraging younger sons to seek opportunities elsewhere. Political competition among ambitious rulers likely rewarded successful military leaders who could acquire prestige through overseas ventures. Improvements in shipbuilding made longer voyages increasingly practical. Expanding trade networks exposed Scandinavians to the wealth of neighboring kingdoms, revealing monasteries, ports, and towns that possessed considerable riches but often limited defenses. European circumstances also played an important role. Following centuries of instability after Rome's collapse, kingdoms such as the Carolingian Empire and Anglo-Saxon England had become wealthier and more organized. Monasteries accumulated precious manuscripts, ornate metalwork, and stores of silver. Coastal communities grew prosperous through commerce. Ironically, the very stability that allowed these societies to flourish also created attractive targets for seaborne raiders. Yet it would be misleading to imagine that every Scandinavian suddenly embraced violence. Most people continued living much as their ancestors had for generations. They farmed, fished, traded, married, raised children, attended seasonal gatherings, and honored their gods. Only a relatively small portion of the population participated directly in the overseas expeditions that later defined the Viking Age. The word Vikinger itself referred not to an entire people, but to an activity. Going on a Viking meant embarking upon an overseas expedition, often involving raiding, trading, exploration, or some combination of all three. A farmer might spend most of his life tending fields, yet occasionally join a voyage during the summer months before returning home for harvest. This distinction is important because it reminds us that the Viking Age was never solely about conquest. It emerged from ordinary communities, shaped by demanding landscapes, complex social relationships, evolving political ambitions, and generations of maritime experience. Long before Scandinavian ships appeared unexpectedly off the coasts of Britain and Francia, the foundations had already been laid in quiet farming settlements scattered among fjords, forests, and islands. As the 8th century drew toward its close, these communities stood on the threshold of a remarkable period of expansion. Their ships were becoming faster. Their leaders hungered for prestige and wealth. Trade routes connected them to distant markets. And beyond the horizon lay kingdoms that scarcely imagined the visitors who would soon arrive from the northern seas. For generations, Scandinavian ships had crossed the waters of northern Europe, carrying merchants, fishermen, craftsmen, and explorers. Their voyages connected distant communities through commerce and shared experience. Then, during the final years of the 8th century, those same ships began arriving on foreign shores with very different intentions. To the people who witnessed these encounters, it seemed as though fierce warriors had appeared almost without warning from beyond the edge of the known world. History often marks the beginning of the Viking Age with a single dramatic event. On the northeast coast of England lay the island monastery of Lindisfarne. Founded in the 7th century by Irish missionaries, it had become one of the great religious centers of Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Monks copied illuminated manuscripts, preserved sacred relics, welcomed pilgrims, and maintained a quiet life centered upon prayer and scholarship. Isolated from the mainland by tides and surrounded by the North Sea, Lindisfarne appeared to offer both spiritual peace and physical security. That sense of security ended in the summer of 793. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The chronicler described terrible omens said to have appeared beforehand: violent storms, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons seen in the sky. Whether these reports reflected genuine observations or later religious interpretation, they reveal the profound shock that followed the attack. The monastery was looted. Treasured religious objects fashioned from gold and silver disappeared. Buildings were damaged, monks were killed, and others were carried away into slavery. Word of the assault spread rapidly across Christian Europe, where monasteries occupied a place far beyond their economic value. They served as centers of learning, diplomacy, administration, and spiritual life. An attack on such a place seemed almost unimaginable. Yet, from the perspective of the raiders, Lindisfarne presented an attractive target. The monastery possessed considerable wealth accumulated through royal patronage and centuries of donations. Precious metal, decorated reliquaries, crosses, chalices, and manuscripts. Unlike fortified towns or royal strongholds, monasteries generally lacked substantial military defenses. They stood close to navigable coastlines, making them accessible to fast-moving ships, capable of landing unexpectedly before departing just as quickly. Religion itself was probably not the principal motive. Modern historians generally reject the idea that the Vikings launched religious wars against Christianity during these early raids. Scandinavians remained followers of their own traditional beliefs, but surviving evidence suggests they viewed monasteries primarily as wealthy institutions rather than theological enemies. Gold and silver retained their value regardless of the symbols engraved upon them. The monks, however, naturally interpreted these events through their own religious worldview. To Christian chroniclers, the raids represented divine punishment, apocalyptic warning, or assaults by pagan enemies against the church itself. Their accounts survive in considerable detail precisely because monasteries possessed educated writers capable of recording these traumatic experiences. Scandinavian raiders left almost no written descriptions of their own. As a result, historians must carefully balance the perspectives preserved in Christian chronicles with archaeological discoveries and evidence from Scandinavia itself. The written sources vividly describe the fear experienced by those under attack, while archaeology often reveals broader patterns of trade, settlement, and cultural exchange occurring alongside the violence. Lindisfarne became famous because it was recorded. It was not necessarily the first Scandinavian raid beyond Scandinavia. A few years earlier, in 789, 3 ships had landed on the southern coast of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex near Portland. The local reeve apparently assumed the newcomers were ordinary merchants and rode out to greet them. Instead, he and his companions were killed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this brief incident without elaboration. Yet historians often regard it as the earliest documented Viking attack on England. It is possible, however, that Scandinavian raiders had conducted other expeditions before either event. Written records from Northern Europe remain fragmentary during this period. Small raids may have simply gone unnoticed or unrecorded. Archaeological evidence occasionally suggests Scandinavian contact with foreign coasts predating the famous attacks, though definitive conclusions remain difficult. Whether or not Lindisfarne marked the absolute beginning, it undeniably changed European perceptions. Within a few years, additional monasteries suffered similar assaults. The monastery of Jarl, another great center of learning associated with the Venerable Bede, experienced raids during the early 9th century. Along the western coasts of Britain and Ireland, monasteries at Iona and other isolated religious communities faced repeated attacks. Their coastal locations, once advantageous for communication and missionary work, now exposed them to unexpected visitors arriving from the sea. Ireland proved particularly vulnerable. Unlike the larger kingdoms developing in England and Francia, Ireland remains politically fragmented among numerous regional rulers. Monasteries often possessed considerable wealth while existing independently from nearby kings. Raiders quickly recognized both their value and their limited defenses. The monastery on the island of Iona endured repeated assaults beginning in the final years of the 8th century. Founded by Saint Columba in the 6th century, Iona occupied an important place in the Christian history of both Ireland and Scotland. Its treasures, sacred relics, and respected community of monks attracted Scandinavian attention more than once. Some attacks proved relatively limited, while others inflicted devastating losses upon the monastery's inhabitants. These early raids shared several characteristics. They were generally small in scale. A handful of ships carrying perhaps a few dozen warriors could strike rapidly before local rulers organized any meaningful response. The raiders seized portable wealth, captured slaves when possible, gathered supplies, and returned to sea. They did not yet attempt permanent conquest or extensive settlement. Speed mattered more than numbers. Longships could cross open water with remarkable efficiency before entering shallow estuaries or beaches inaccessible to larger vessels. Crews needed no permanent harbor and could withdraw before defenders assembled. Local communities accustomed to threats arriving over land found themselves confronting enemies capable of appearing almost anywhere along the coastline. The psychological impact exceeded the military scale. Coastal settlements suddenly understood that distance from political frontiers offered little protection. The sea, once associated primarily with trade and fishing, had become an avenue for surprise attack. The Carolingian Empire soon experienced the same realization. Ruled during much of this period by Charlemagne, the Frankish kingdom stretched across large portions of Western Europe. It represented one of the most powerful political entities since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, possessing substantial armies, sophisticated administration, and considerable wealth. Even so, its extensive coastline remained difficult to defend. During the closing years of Charlemagne's reign, Scandinavian raids began striking Frisian ports and settlements along the North Sea. Merchants, monasteries, and trading towns found themselves exposed to fast-moving attacks launched from the sea. Frankish records reveal growing concern. Charlemagne ordered improvements to coastal defenses and reportedly established patrol fleets in an effort to intercept future raiders. Fortifications appeared near vulnerable river mouths, while local officials received greater responsibility for organizing regional defense. These efforts achieved mixed results. The very qualities that made Viking ships effective also made them difficult to counter. They required no permanent bases near their targets and could exploit rivers that penetrated deep into the European interior. Once aboard their ships, the raiders remained remarkably mobile. Historians have long debated why this wave of expansion accelerated around the end of the 8th century. Older explanations often emphasized overpopulation or simple greed. Modern scholarship presents a more nuanced picture. Population growth likely played some role in certain regions, particularly where arable land remained limited. Political competition among Scandinavian leaders encouraged ambitious young warriors to seek wealth capable of enhancing personal reputation. Improvements in maritime technology made longer voyages practical. Expanding trade networks exposed Scandinavians to prosperous foreign societies, whose wealth could be acquired through either peaceful or forceful exchange. Conditions within Europe also mattered. The relative prosperity of kingdoms such as the Anglo-Saxon England and the Carolingian Empire created valuable targets. Monasteries accumulated precious metals over generations. Trading towns grew wealthy as commerce expanded. Stable governments encouraged economic developments, yet coastal defenses often lagged behind. Opportunity and capability developed together. It is also important to remember that raiding represented only one part of Scandinavian activity abroad. Even during these earliest years, merchants continued traveling many of the same routes. Peaceful exchange and violent confrontation frequently occurred side by side. A Scandinavian trader welcomed in one port might hear stories that encouraged a later raiding expedition elsewhere. Likewise, successful raiders often sold their captured goods through established commercial markets back home. The boundaries remained remarkably fluid. A single voyage might involve trade at one destination, diplomacy at another, and violence at a third, depending entirely upon local circumstances. The word Viking itself reflected this flexibility. As discussed earlier, going on a Viking described participation in an overseas expedition rather than membership in a fixed profession or ethnic group. Most participants remained farmers for much of the year. Seasonal expeditions fit naturally between planting and harvest, allowing individuals to pursue wealth without abandoning their farms permanently. Success brought prestige. A warrior returning home with silver, weapons, fine cloth, or exotic goods enhanced not only his own standing, but also that of the local leader who had organized the expedition. Wealth distributed through gifts strengthened political alliances and attracted additional followers. Each successful voyage encouraged another. Communities gained confidence as navigational knowledge expanded. Leaders acquired greater resources to finance future expeditions. Young men who had witnessed successful raids became eager to participate themselves. The cycle accelerated. But foreign kingdoms also adapted. Monasteries gradually relocated valuable treasures farther inland or strengthened their defenses where possible. Coastal watch systems improved, fortified settlements multiplied, and rulers devoted increasing attention to naval preparedness. Europe had begun learning that Scandinavian attacks represented more than isolated incidents. The raiders were becoming a permanent feature of Northern European politics. Still, during these opening decades, the Viking Age remained far from its greatest scale. The enormous armies that would later conquer kingdoms had not yet appeared. Scandinavian rulers had not begun carving out overseas territories, nor had extensive colonies transformed the North Atlantic. Those developments still lay in the future. The years around 790 to 830 instead marked the beginning of a profound shift. What had once been occasional maritime contact between neighboring regions evolved into something much larger. Scandinavian sailors had demonstrated that they could strike wealthy kingdoms across the sea with remarkable speed. European rulers recognized a new strategic challenge unlike any they had previously faced. The sea had become a frontier shared by every kingdom bordering the North Atlantic. The first raids announced the arrival of the Viking Age, but they were only its opening chapter. Before long, small bands of seasonal raiders would give way to organized fleets, ambitious leaders, and armies large enough not merely to plunder foreign kingdoms, but to settle within them and reshape the political map of Europe itself. For nearly 70 years after the raid on Lindisfarne, Viking activity in Britain followed a familiar pattern. Small fleets appeared with the arrival of spring. Coastal monasteries, villages, and trading ports found themselves vulnerable to swift attacks that lasted only days or even hours. Silver, livestock, food, and captives were loaded aboard waiting ships before the raiders disappeared once again across the sea. Local rulers occasionally managed to defeat individual expeditions, but no kingdom had yet discovered a permanent solution. And then, in the middle of the 9th century, everything changed. The Scandinavians who arrived in England in the year 865 did not resemble the seasonal raiding parties that had troubled the coasts for generations. They came not as visitors. They came intending to stay. The force that landed in East Anglia would become known to history as the Great Heathen Army. Its exact size remains uncertain. Medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers, while the term great reflected its significance as much as its manpower. Modern historians generally believe the army probably consisted of several thousand men, reinforced over time by additional fleets arriving from Scandinavia and Viking settlements throughout the British Isles. Even if its numbers were modest by later medieval standards, it represented something unprecedented. Unlike earlier expeditions, this army possessed the organization, leadership, and logistical support necessary to campaign continuously for years rather than months. It wintered in conquered territory instead of returning home after each season. It negotiated with local rulers, gathered supplies from occupied lands, and moved strategically between kingdoms. England itself was not yet a single nation. Instead, the island was divided among several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that historians collectively call the Heptarchy, although the political situation had always been more complex than 7 neatly defined states. By the 9th century, 4 kingdoms dominated much of England. Northumbria occupied the north. Mercia controlled much of the Midlands. East Anglia lay along the eastern coast, and Wessex ruled the south and southwest. These kingdoms frequently cooperated against common enemies, but just as often they competed with one another through shifting alliances, dynastic rivalries, and occasional warfare. Political division offered opportunities. The Viking leaders understood that no unified English kingdom existed to oppose them. Defeating one ruler did not automatically unite the others. Every campaign unfolded within a landscape already shaped by local disputes and competing ambitions. The medieval sources identify several important Viking leaders associated with the great heathen army. Among the most famous were Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan Ragnarsson, and Ubba, figures later linked through Norse tradition to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. According to later sagas, the invasion sought revenge for Ragnar's execution at the hands of King Aelle of Northumbria. This story remains one of the most famous episodes in Viking legend. Whether it reflects historical reality is far less certain. The earliest English sources mention the Viking commanders, but say little about revenge for Ragnar. The detailed narrative connecting the invasion to Ragnar's death appears primarily in later Icelandic sagas, composed centuries afterward. Most historians therefore distinguish between the legendary tradition and the evidence contemporary with the invasion itself. Whatever motivated individual leaders, the campaign quickly gathered momentum. The army first established itself in East Anglia. Rather than launching an immediate attack, the Vikings accepted tribute, gathered horses, and spent the winter preparing for future operations. Acquiring horses dramatically increased their mobility. Although Viking armies generally fought on foot, mounted transport allowed them to move rapidly between objectives, surprising defenders and covering great distances in relatively short periods. Their first major target became Northumbria. The kingdom already suffered from internal conflict. Two rival kings, Osbert and Aelle, contested control of the throne. Faced with the Scandinavian invasion, they temporarily set aside their differences and united against the common threat. But the effort came too late. In 867, the Viking army captured the city of York, known to the Anglo-Saxons as Eferwich. York possessed immense strategic importance. Founded originally as the Roman city of Eboracum, it remained one of northern England's largest urban centers. Its location along major roads and rivers made it a valuable military and commercial prize. The Northumbrian kings attempted to retake the city. The battle ended in disaster. Both Osbert and Aelle were killed, though the precise circumstances remain uncertain. Later Norse tradition famously claims that Aelle suffered execution through the gruesome ritual known as the Blood Eagle. Here again, historians urge caution. Descriptions of the Blood Eagle appear primarily in later literary sources, rather than in contemporary accounts. Some scholars believe the ritual may represent poetic symbolism or later embellishment, rather than an event that can be confirmed historically. The mainstream views remain that Aelle died during or shortly after the fighting, while the dramatic details belong to the uncertain boundary between history and legend. With Northumbria subdued, the Viking leaders installed a ruler willing to cooperate with them. Direct occupation of every conquered territory was unnecessary. Allowing local kings to govern under Scandinavian influence often proved more practical than replacing existing administrative structures entirely. attention soon turned to Mercia. The Viking army advanced into the kingdom during 867 and captured Nottingham. Mercia appealed to Wessex for assistance, bringing together two kingdoms that recognized the growing danger posed by the invaders. King Burgred of Mercia and King Ethelred of Wessex, accompanied by his younger brother Alfred, marched against Nottingham. The resulting campaign produced no decisive battle. Unable to storm the Viking defenses, the Anglo-Saxon rulers negotiated instead. Tribute was paid, and the Scandinavian army withdrew, preserving its strength for future campaigns. This pattern appeared repeatedly. The Vikings rarely sought battles on unfavorable terms. When negotiation offered greater profit than unnecessary bloodshed, they negotiated. When swift movement provided advantages over prolonged sieges, they moved. Their flexibility became one of their greatest strengths. In 869, the army returned to East Anglia. This campaign produced one of the Viking Age's most enduring stories. King Edmund of East Anglia refused to abandon his Christian faith or surrender his kingdom. According to later accounts, he was captured after the battle, bound to a tree, shot with arrows, and finally beheaded after rejecting demands to renounce Christianity. Edmund's death transformed him into one of medieval England's most beloved saints. While the details of his martyrdom reflect religious tradition as much as historical reporting, there is little doubt that he was killed during the Viking conquest of his kingdom. His shrine would later become an important pilgrimage destination, and the town of Bury St. Edmunds still preserves his memory today. By the early 870s, only Wessex remained unconquered. Its survival owed much to its geography. The kingdom's landscape included forests, marshes, and hill country less favorable to large invading armies than the flatter regions farther east. More importantly, Wessex possessed determined leadership. King Ethelred died in 871. His younger brother Alfred inherited a kingdom under immense pressure. Known today as Alfred the Great, he stands among the most influential rulers in English history. Yet when he became king, nothing about his situation guaranteed success. The Vikings won several important battles during the opening years of Alfred's reign. Although Wessex occasionally achieved victories of its own, the balance of power often favored the invaders. Alfred repeatedly found himself forced into difficult negotiations simply to preserve his kingdom's existence. The crisis reached its height in the winter of 878. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack during the Christmas season, catching Alfred largely unprepared. Wessex collapsed with startling speed. Alfred fled into the marshes of Somerset. This period later inspired countless legends. One famous story describes Alfred allowing cakes to burn while hiding in the home of a peasant woman, earning her sharp rebuke for his apparent carelessness. Historians cannot verify the tale, but it reflects the image of a king reduced temporarily to hardship before achieving eventual triumph. The marshes of Athelney offered genuine protection. Their difficult terrain allowed Alfred to gather loyal supporters while remaining beyond the immediate reach of Viking forces. During these months, he reorganized what remained of his kingdom's resistance. Rather than surrendering, he prepared to fight again. In the spring of 878, Alfred emerged from hiding. Messengers summoned men from across Wessex to join him. The response demonstrated that the kingdom's political structure had survived despite military setbacks. Local leaders rallied their followers, and Alfred assembled an army capable of confronting Guthrum directly. The two forces met at the Battle of Edington. The exact location remains uncertain, though it probably lay in present-day Wiltshire. Unlike many earlier encounters, this battle produced a decisive result. Alfred's army defeated the Vikings and forced Guthrum to retreat into a fortified position. Surrounded and unable to continue the campaign, Guthrum entered negotiations. The resulting agreement changed English history. Under the Treaty of Wedmore, Guthrum accepted baptism as a Christian, with Alfred serving as one of his sponsors. Although the precise terms survive only indirectly, the settlement established a lasting peace between Wessex and Guthrum's followers. Conversion carried political as well as religious significance. Accepting Christianity allowed Guthrum to integrate more easily into relations with neighboring kingdoms, while reinforcing the legitimacy of the agreement. Peace, however, did not mean the end of Viking England. Instead, England gradually became divided between two distinct spheres. The area controlled largely by Scandinavian settlers became known as Danelaw. This was not an independent Viking kingdom in the modern sense, but rather a broad region where Danish law, customs, language, and political authority predominated. It extended across much of northern and eastern England, including York, East Anglia, and large portions of Mercia. Life within the Danelaw blended Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Many Viking warriors settled permanently upon the land, becoming farmers instead of full-time raiders. Towns expanded, trade flourished. Intermarriage became increasingly common. Norse words entered the English language, particularly in the north and east, where many survive even today. Place names still preserve this legacy. Settlements ending in B, such as Derby, Grimsby, and Whitby, often reflect Old Norse origins, with B meaning village or farmstead. Endings like Thorpe and Thwaite similarly reveal Scandinavian influence upon the English landscape. Alfred understood that military victory alone would not secure Wessex's future, and so he undertook sweeping reforms. A network of fortified towns known as burhs appeared throughout his kingdom, carefully positioned so that no community lay far from defensive refuge. These strongholds provided protection while serving as administrative and commercial centers. Roads connecting the burhs received increased attention, allowing troops to move rapidly between them. Alfred also reorganized military service. Rather than requiring every able-bodied man to serve continuously, he divided responsibilities between rotating groups. One force remained in the field, while another returned home to maintain farms and harvest crops. This system allowed Wessex to sustain prolonged campaigns without destroying its own agricultural economy. Perhaps most importantly, Alfred invested in learning. He encouraged the translation of important Latin works into Old English, promoted education among clergy and nobles, and helped establish a tradition of written history that preserved invaluable records of his age. By the end of the 9th century, England had been transformed. The great heathen army had conquered kingdoms, overthrown dynasties, founded settlements, and reshaped the political geography of Britain. Yet its greatest legacy extended beyond the battlefield. It forced Anglo-Saxon rulers to reconsider how kingdoms should be defended, administered, and unified. From the struggle against Viking expansion emerged stronger institutions, more centralized government, and eventually the idea of a single English kingdom. At the same time, Scandinavian settlers became an enduring part of that kingdom's population, contributing language, law, commerce, and culture in ways that would continue long after the age of conquest had passed. The Viking Age was no longer defined solely by raids launched from distant shores. The Northmen had become neighbors, rulers, merchants, and farmers within England itself, and their ambitions were beginning to reach even farther across the northern seas. The earliest Viking expeditions had been measured in days. Ships crossed the North Sea, struck a monastery or trading port, gathered whatever wealth they could carry, and returned home before local rulers organized an effective response. Those voyages demanded courage and skill, but they remained temporary. The Scandinavian sailors who stepped ashore always expected to return to their farms before another season had passed. During the 9th century, that expectation gradually changed. And that's because Viking ships began carrying more than warriors. They began carrying families. They transported livestock, tools, timber, seeds, household possessions, and everything necessary to establish new communities. The sea routes that had once supported seasonal raids became corridors of migration, connecting Scandinavia with lands that many settlers would never leave again. Some departures were driven by opportunity, while others reflected necessity. Political rivalries within Scandinavia encouraged ambitious leaders to seek new territory where they could establish independent authority. Growing trade networks revealed fertile lands abroad. Younger sons, who stood to inherit little property at home, found possibilities beyond the horizon that simply did not exist within their own districts. Whatever individual motivations may have been, the result was the gradual creation of a Norse world stretching across much of the North Atlantic. The first permanent settlements appeared close to Scandinavia. The Northern Isles, lying off Scotland's coast, offered excellent harbors, productive fishing grounds, and strategic positions along maritime routes connecting Norway with the British Isles. The Orkney and Shetland Islands became important stepping stones for voyages farther west. Archaeological evidence suggests Scandinavian influence developed here surprisingly early. Over time, Norse settlers established farming communities, built longhouses, introduced their own legal customs, and gradually became the dominant population in many areas. The earlier Pictish inhabitants did not disappear entirely, but Norse language and culture came to define much of island life. The Orkney Islands eventually developed into one of the most influential Norse earldoms outside Scandinavia itself. Ruled by powerful Jarls who often balanced relationship between Norwegian kings and local interests, Orkney became a center of trade, politics, and seafaring throughout the Viking Age. The islands also demonstrate an important aspect of Viking expansion. Settlements rarely meant simple replacement. Instead, newcomers and existing populations frequently interacted in complicated ways. Marriages occurred across cultural boundaries. Agricultural techniques blended. Local traditions survived alongside Scandinavian customs. The result often became something neither entirely Norse nor entirely native. The Hebrides experienced similar developments. Stretching along Scotland's western coast, these islands occupied valuable positions controlling routes through the Irish Sea. Scandinavian settlers established themselves throughout much of the archipelago, where Norse language remained influential for centuries. Some islands became almost completely Scandinavian in character. Others preserved stronger Gaelic traditions while still participating in Norse political networks. Successful settlements attracted additional migrants. Trading stations expanded into villages. Temporary camps became permanent farms. Children born within these new communities grew up regarding the islands as their homeland rather than distant colonial outposts. Ireland followed a somewhat different path. Earlier chapters described the Viking raids upon Irish monasteries during the closing years of the 8th century. Those attacks continued throughout the 9th, but they gradually evolved into something more permanent. The Scandinavians established fortified camps known as longports. These ship camps provided secure harbors where fleets could winter safely instead of returning to Scandinavia after every campaign. Protected by earthworks and timber palisades, they stored ships, supplies, and captured goods, while serving as operational bases for future expeditions. Some remained temporary. Others developed into towns. The most famous example emerged beside the River Liffey. What began as a fortified Norse settlement eventually became Dublin. Founded around the middle of the 9th century, Dublin occupied an excellent natural harbor, connected to both inland river routes and the Irish Sea. Merchants soon recognized its commercial potential. Craftsmen established workshops. Traders from Ireland, Britain, Scandinavia, Francia, and beyond gathered within its markets. Over time, Dublin grew into one of the busiest ports in northwestern Europe. Its rulers alternated between independence and alliances with Irish kings, while its population became increasingly mixed. Norse settlers married into Irish families, adopted local customs, and participated in the complex politics of the island. This same pattern appeared elsewhere. Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick all trace important stages of their early urban development to Viking foundations. Ironically, the Scandinavians who had first arrived as raiders became some of Ireland's greatest town builders. Before their arrival, Ireland possessed relatively few large urban cities. Viking trading settlements introduced new forms of permanent commercial organization that continued long after Scandinavian political influence declined. The relationship between Norse settlers and Irish kingdoms remained fluid. Periods of warfare alternated with diplomacy. Irish rulers occasionally hired Viking warriors as allies against rival kings. Scandinavian leaders entered local political disputes, while Irish dynasties sometimes competed for control of prosperous Norse towns. The cultural exchange proved equally significant. Archaeological discoveries reveal Irish artistic influences appearing within Scandinavian metalwork, while Norse decorative styles found expression in Irish craftsmanship. Christian symbols and traditional Norse imagery occasionally appeared together, reflecting communities where religious and cultural boundaries gradually softened. Farther north, the Isle of Man developed into another important center of Norse settlement. Situated almost midway between Ireland, Scotland, England and Wales, the island occupied an ideal location for maritime trade. Its famous stone crosses preserve one of the clearest examples of cultural blending during the Viking Age. Many combine Christian imagery with scenes drawn from Norse mythology, suggesting communities where conversion occurred gradually rather than abruptly. The island's parliament, known today as Tynwald, even traces its origins to the Norse assembly tradition known as the Thing, making it one of the oldest continuously functioning parliamentary institutions in the world. By the middle of the 9th century, Scandinavian sailors had become quite familiar with the northern Atlantic. Their curiosity naturally extended farther west. Beyond the British Isles lay the Faroe Isles. These isolated volcanic islands rise from the North Atlantic roughly halfway between Norway and Iceland. The precise sequence of settlements remains debated among historians. Irish monks may have visited or even lived there before the arrival of Scandinavians. The strongest archaeological evidence, however, points toward permanent Norse settlement during the 9th century. And life in the Faroes demanded resilience. Steep hills limited agriculture, while harsh weather frequently interrupted communication with neighboring lands. Yet the islands offered rich fishing grounds and abundant grazing for sheep. Their strategic position also made them valuable stopping points for longer voyages into the Atlantic. From the Faroes, another destination gradually entered Scandinavian awareness: Iceland. According to the medieval Book of Settlements, occasional voyages reached Iceland before permanent colonization began. The first documented Norse explorer, traditionally credited with deliberately sailing there, was Nycolas, who reportedly became lost while traveling to the Faroe Islands. Finding an unfamiliar coast instead, he climbed a nearby mountain and observed snow covering the landscape. Believing the island permanently frozen, he supposedly named it Snaeland, or Snowland. Another explorer, Karthar Svavarson, circumnavigated the island and confirmed that it was indeed a large landmass rather than part of another coastline. Permanent settlement began soon afterward. The individual traditionally recognized as Iceland's first permanent Norse settler was Ingolfr Arnarsson. According to Icelandic tradition, he arrived around 874. The stories surrounding his voyage possess elements of both history and legend. One famous account describes Ingolfr throwing the carved pillars from his high seat overboard before reaching land, declaring that he would establish his home wherever the gods allowed them to wash ashore. After searching for several years, his followers eventually found the pillars near the southwestern coast. There, Ingolfr founded the settlement that became Reykjavik. Whether every detail occurred exactly as later tradition records cannot be known, but what remains well established is that Iceland experienced rapid settlement during the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Families arrived primarily from western Norway, though many also brought Gaelic wives, servants, and companions acquired through earlier settlement in Scotland and Ireland. Genetic studies reflect this mixture. Modern Icelanders possess ancestry derived from both Scandinavia and the British Isles, illustrating how migration during the Viking Age often involved culturally diverse communities rather than exclusively Norse populations. Unlike many European kingdoms, Iceland developed without a king. Instead, independent chieftains known as Gothar exercised local authority while cooperating through assemblies modeled upon older Scandinavian traditions. The most famous of these gatherings became the Althingi. Established around the year 930 at Thingvellir, the Althingi brought together chieftains and free farmers from across Iceland to settle disputes, establish laws, arrange marriages, negotiate alliances, and resolve conflicts. It possessed no palace, no permanent army enforced its decisions. Authority rested largely upon shared respect for customary law and the willingness of participating communities to uphold legal judgments. The Althingi remains one of the oldest parliamentary institutions in the world. Its survival reflects the importance Scandinavian society placed upon legal assemblies long before written constitutions became common elsewhere. Life in Iceland also demanded adaptation. The island lacked extensive forests suitable for large-scale shipbuilding. Volcanic activity shaped portions of the landscape, while harsh winters tested both livestock and settlers. Yet Iceland offered valuable grazing land, abundant fish, seabirds, seals, and access to resources unavailable elsewhere. Communities gradually prospered, and they also preserved something invaluable. Centuries later, Icelandic scholars recorded many of the sagas, poems, and myths that now form the principal written sources for our understanding of Norse mythology and early Scandinavian history. Ironically, much of what is known about pagan Viking culture survives because Christian Icelanders carefully preserved these traditions after conversion. As settlement expanded westward, another remarkable figure entered history, Eric Thorvaldsson. Remembered as Eric the Red, he earned his nickname because of his striking red hair and beard, though later stories also associate the name with his fiery temperament. After being outlawed from Iceland following a series of violent disputes, Eric sailed farther west during the 980s. There, he encountered a vast island already glimpsed by earlier explorers. Seeking to attract future settlers, he named it Greenland. The choice was almost certainly deliberate. Although southern Greenland does possess green pastures during the short Arctic summer, the name probably emphasized its most inviting features while encouraging immigration. It proved effective. Several years later, Eric returned with settlers who established small farming communities along Greenland's southwestern fjords. Despite the name, survival remained difficult. Livestock farming was possible only within limited coastal regions. Trade became essential, particularly through the export of walrus ivory, furs, hides, and other Arctic products valued throughout Europe. These isolated settlements represented the western edge of the known European world. Their existence depended entirely upon the maritime knowledge accumulated over generations of Scandinavian exploration. By the close of the 10th century, Viking expansion had transformed the map of the North Atlantic. What began as seasonal voyages had become an interconnected maritime civilization stretching from Norway to Greenland. Merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and sailors crossed distances that earlier generations scarcely imagined. They founded towns, established legal institutions, blended cultures with neighboring peoples, and created communities that would endure for centuries. Their ships continued pushing westward. Beyond Greenland lay another coastline, unknown to the kingdoms of Europe, but soon to become the destination of one of history's most remarkable voyages. Long before Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic, Norse sailors would reach a new continent, extending the Viking world farther than anyone in medieval Europe believed possible. By the close of the 10th century, the Scandinavian world stretched across the North Atlantic. Norwegian farmers had settled Iceland. Their descendants had established communities along the fjords of Greenland. Merchant vessels crossed seas that Roman geographers scarcely knew existed, while sailors carried news between settlements separated by thousands of miles of open water. Yet for some, Greenland did not represent the end of the world. It was only the next stopping point. Beyond its western horizon lay another coastline. The discovery of North America by Norse explorers stands among the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. It occurred nearly 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean, and almost certainly represents the earliest confirmed European contact with the American continent. Like many episodes from Viking history, however, the story survives through a mixture of archaeology, medieval literature, and historical debate. The 2 principal written accounts appear in Icelandic works known as the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. Both were written during the 13th century, more than 200 years after the events they describe. They agree on the broad outline, but they differ in many details. Historians therefore compare the sagas carefully while testing their claims against archaeological evidence. The story begins not with Leif Erikson, but with another sailor. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson. According to the sagas, Bjarni set sail from Iceland toward Greenland around the year 986, after learning that his father had joined Eric the Red's new colony. Storms drove his ship far off course. Instead of reaching Greenland immediately, Bjarni encountered unfamiliar coastlines covered with forests and low hills, unlike anything he expected. Curiously, he did not land. Whether eager to find his father or unconvinced that the unknown shores offered anything of value, Bjarni continued sailing until he eventually reached Greenland. His account nevertheless attracted attention. Among those who listened was Leif Erikson. The son of Eric the Red had grown up during Greenland's earliest years. Unlike his father, who established the colony, Leif belonged to a generation already accustomed to life on the western edge of the known world. The unexplored lands described by Bjarni naturally stirred his curiosity. According to the sagas, Leif purchased Bjarni's ship and organized an expedition specifically to investigate these mysterious coasts. Sometime around the year 1000, he sailed westward. The exact date remains uncertain. Most historians place the voyage somewhere near the turn of the 11th century. As Leif and his companions explored the coastline, they reportedly encountered several distinct regions. The first they named Helluland, meaning land of flat stones. Helluland likely corresponds to modern Baffin Island in northern Canada. The landscape matched the description preserved in the sagas, consisting largely of rocky terrain with relatively little vegetation. Continuing south, the explorers reached another region. They called it Markland. The name means forest land. Unlike Greenland, where timber remained scarce, Markland offered abundant trees suitable for construction and ship repair. Most scholars identify this area with the coast of Labrador, whose extensive forests would indeed have appeared remarkable to settlers accustomed to Greenland's limited woodlands. The final destination became the most famous, Vinland. Its name has inspired centuries of discussion. Traditionally, Vinland has been translated as Wine Land, based upon the saga's description of wild grapes growing there. If accurate, this would suggest a location considerably further south than Newfoundland, perhaps along the Gulf of St. Lawrence or even New Brunswick. Other scholars note that the Old Norse word vin may also refer to meadows or pasture land. Under this interpretation, Vinland would simply describe fertile grazing country rather than vineyards. The debate continues. Whatever the precise meaning, the sagas portray Vinland as a place of extraordinary abundance compared with Greenland. Salmon filled the rivers. Grass remained green through much of the year. Timber stood readily available. Wild crops appeared plentiful. To settlers accustomed to the demanding conditions of Greenland, such resources must have seemed almost unbelievable. For centuries, historians debated whether these voyages actually occurred. The sagas contained enough realistic detail to deserve some serious attention, yet no physical evidence had confirmed the existence of a Norse settlement in North America. That changed during the 20th century. In the early 1960s, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad investigated local traditions on the northern tip of Newfoundland. There, they uncovered one of the most important archaeological discoveries in modern history. The site became known as Lansall Meadows. Excavations revealed unmistakable evidence of Norse occupation. The remains included turf-walled buildings remarkably similar to structures found in Iceland and Greenland. Iron-working facilities demonstrated that Scandinavian craftsmen had smelted bog iron on site. Rivets used in shipbuilding, spindle whorls for textile production, woodworking tools, and numerous everyday objects all reflected unmistakably Norse craftsmanship. Radiocarbon dating and later scientific studies placed the settlement around the year 1000, closely matching the chronology preserved in the Icelandic sagas. The discovery fundamentally transformed historical understanding. What earlier generations had dismissed as legend now possessed undeniable archaeological confirmation. Europeans had indeed reached North America centuries before Columbus. Leonce Meadows appears to have functioned less as a permanent colony than as an exploration and supply base. The settlement remained relatively small. Perhaps 70 to 90 people occupied it during periods of use. The buildings included workshops, sleeping quarters, storage facilities, and spaces devoted to repairing ships. The site likely served expeditions exploring farther south rather than supporting a large permanent population. This interpretation fits the archaeological evidence. Little suggests long-term farming on the scale found in Iceland or Greenland. Instead, the settlement appears designed to support seasonal activity involving exploration, timber gathering, and perhaps the collection of other valuable resources. One particularly significant discovery involved butternuts. These trees do not grow naturally in Newfoundland. Their presence indicates that Norse explorers traveled considerably farther south before returning to Leonce Meadows with gathered materials. Exactly how far remains uncertain. The sagas also describe encounters with the people already living in these lands. They refer to them collectively as Skrælingr. The meaning of the term remains debated, though it became the Norse word applied to indigenous peoples encountered in Greenland and North America. The identity of these communities depends partly upon geography and chronology. Those living around Newfoundland during the period may have belonged to the ancestors of the Beothuk. though other indigenous groups occupied neighboring regions, and the archaeological picture remains complex. The sagas portray these encounters as cautious at first. Trade reportedly occurred. The Norse exchanged red cloth and other manufactured goods for animal pelts. Communication remained limited, but both sides initially appear willing to interact peacefully. The situation eventually deteriorated. The sagas describe violent clashes in which indigenous warriors greatly outnumbered the Scandinavian explorers. Although the Norse possessed superior iron weapons, they remained only a small expedition operating thousands of miles from reinforcement. Maintaining a permanent colony under such circumstances proved extremely difficult. The sagas preserve memorable individual stories from these encounters. One describes Freydis, generally identified as Leif's sister, who supposedly frightened attacking warriors by seizing a sword and striking her exposed breast while shouting defiantly. Whether every detail occurred exactly as described, of course, cannot be determined. But like many saga episodes, literary embellishment almost certainly shaped the surviving narrative. The broader picture, however, remains plausible. Small Scandinavian settlements faced enormous logistical challenges while operating within lands already inhabited by established indigenous societies. Distance compounded every difficulty. A voyage from Greenland to Vinland required favorable weather, reliable ships, skilled crews, and careful planning. Any colony depended entirely upon communication across vast stretches of ocean. Disease, accidents, failed harvests, damaged ships, or conflict could quickly threaten survival. Greenland itself struggled to sustain its population. Supporting another colony farther west stretched available resources to their limit. Economic considerations also mattered. Vinland offered timber unavailable in Greenland, but maintaining a permanent settlement simply to acquire wood may not have justified the enormous effort required. Seasonal expeditions proved considerably less demanding. As a result, Norse activity in North America appears to have remained relatively brief. Leon's Meadows was abandoned only after a short period. Whether occasional voyages continued afterward remains uncertain. Some historians believe Greenlanders probably revisited Markland for timber during later generations, supported by scattered documentary references appearing centuries afterward. Definitive archaeological confirmation, however, remains elusive. The settlement disappeared. Knowledge of the Western lands gradually faded. Within Europe, virtually no one beyond the Norse world knew such voyages had ever taken place. The achievement would remain largely forgotten until archaeological discoveries restored it to history almost 1,000 years later. The Vinland expeditions nevertheless reveal something important about the Viking Age. They were not accidents. They represented the culmination of generations spent mastering maritime travel across the North Atlantic. The same shipbuilding traditions, navigational knowledge, and willingness to explore unfamiliar coasts that had carried Scandinavians to Iceland and Greenland naturally encouraged them to continue westward. Each voyage built upon earlier experience. The sailors who reached North America were not venturing blindly into unknown waters. They followed routes established through decades of exploration, using islands as stepping stones across the ocean, while relying upon practical seamanship refined over centuries. Their accomplishment deserves recognition, not because it changed world history in the immediate sense. Unlike Columbus's voyages, the Norse expeditions did not establish lasting communication between Europe and the Americas. No permanent colony survived, no continuous exchange followed. Instead, the Vinland voyages stand as remarkable demonstrations of what Viking Age society had become capable of achieving. A civilization that had once consisted primarily of scattered farming communities along Scandinavian fjords had developed the maritime knowledge necessary to cross one of the world's greatest oceans using wooden ships guided only by experience, observation, and extraordinary confidence in the sea. By the beginning of the 11th century, Viking expansion had reached its greatest geographical extent. From the rivers leading toward Constantinople to the distant shores of North America, Scandinavian sailors had connected an immense portion of the known world. Yet, even as exploration reached its furthest limits, profound changes were reshaping Scandinavia itself. The old gods were yielding to Christianity. Independent chieftains answered to powerful kings, and the age of seasonal raiding gave way to organized kingdoms seeking stability rather than expansion. The Viking Age is often remembered through the deeds of remarkable individuals. Names such as Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Eric the Red, Leif Erikson have all become inseparable from the era. Yet behind every famous expedition stood a more gradual transformation unfolding within Scandinavia itself. The political landscape that had produced generations of independent chieftains was beginning to change. Over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden slowly evolved from collections of competing local rulers into recognizable kingdoms. The process was neither simple nor peaceful. It unfolded through alliances, marriages, warfare, diplomacy, and the growing wealth generated by trade and overseas expansion. The Viking Age was not only an era of seafaring exploration, it was also an age of state building. To appreciate this transformation, it is useful to remember how Scandinavian society had traditionally been organized. Political authority rarely extended far beyond a local district. A powerful chieftain might command loyalty from several neighboring valleys or islands, while another ruler controlled the next fjord or stretch of coastline. These leaders owed their position partly to inherited status, but just as importantly to their ability to reward followers with land, wealth, protection, and opportunity. Leadership had to be maintained. A ruler who failed to distribute gifts, win victories, or settle disputes fairly could quickly lose support. Followers were not permanently bound to unsuccessful leaders. They could seek the protection of more capable rivals whose reputations promised greater prosperity. Power remained personal rather than institutional. The relationship between ruler and follower resembled an agreement built upon mutual obligation. Warriors pledged loyalty in exchange for gifts, legal protection, and opportunities to acquire wealth through trade or raiding. This system encouraged constant competition. Successful expeditions brought silver, livestock, weapons, and prestige. That wealth allowed leaders to reward additional followers, who in turn strengthened future expeditions. Over time, some rulers accumulated enough influence to absorb neighboring territories, creating political units larger than anything earlier generations had known. Denmark appears to have experienced political consolidation first. Its geography offered important advantages. Unlike mountainous Norway, Denmark consisted largely of low-lying islands and fertile plains connected by relatively short sea crossings. Communication between regions proved easier. Agriculture supported larger populations, and trade routes linking the North Sea with the Baltic generated considerable wealth. By the early 9th century, Frankish records already referred to Danish kings exercising authority over substantial territories. One of the earliest historically well-attested rulers was King Gudfred, who died in 810. Frankish chroniclers describe him as a formidable opponent of Charlemagne. Gudfred strengthened the great defensive earthwork known as the Donnewerk, a system of fortification stretching across southern Jutland. Originally begun centuries earlier, the Donnewerk protected Denmark's southern frontier while controlling one of the principal land routes into Scandinavia. Its construction required remarkable organization. Thousands of laborers moved enormous quantities of earth and timber, demonstrating that Danish rulers possessed resources extending well beyond those available to ordinary local chieftains. Although Gudfred's reign ended violently, the process of political centralization continued. The most influential Danish ruler of the following century would become Harald Bluetooth. His unusual nickname has inspired modern wireless technology, though its original meaning remains uncertain. Some historians believe it referred to a darkened or damaged tooth, while others suggest the nickname may have carried symbolic meaning now lost. Harald ruled during the second half of the 10th century. By this time, Denmark had become considerably more unified than in earlier generations. Harald strengthened royal authority through both military and administrative reforms. Circular fortresses, known today as Trelleborg forts, appeared across Denmark during his reign. Their remarkably consistent design suggests careful planning directed by a centralized government rather than local initiative. These fortifications remain among the most impressive engineering achievements of the Viking Age. Their particularly circular earthworks enclosed barracks, workshops, storage buildings, and roads laid out according to precise geometric plans. They served both military and political purposes, allowing royal forces to move efficiently while reinforcing the king's authority throughout the realm. Harald also became closely associated with another profound transformation: the gradual conversion of Denmark to Christianity. The famous Jelling stone, often described as Denmark's birth certificate, proclaims that Harald won all Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. The inscription naturally reflects royal propaganda. Conversion occurred gradually over many decades, rather than through a single decree. Even so, the monument illustrates Harald's desire to present himself as both the unifier of Denmark and the ruler responsible for guiding his people toward a new faith. Norway's political development followed a more difficult path. Unlike Denmark, Norway's geography discouraged easy centralization. Deep fjords separated communities from one another, while mountain ranges divided inland valleys. Regional identities remained strong, and local rulers enjoyed considerable independence. One figure nevertheless occupies a central place in Norwegian tradition: Harald Fairhair. According to medieval Icelandic sagas, Fairhair vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had united all of Norway beneath his rule. After years of campaigning, he supposedly fulfilled this promise following victory at the Battle of Hjarsfjord, traditionally dated around 872. The image is memorable. Whether events unfolded exactly as later sagas describe remains less certain. Most historians believe Fairhair was indeed an important ruler, who expanded his authority over significant portions of western Norway. The notion that he completely unified the entire country during a single campaign, however, probably reflects later simplification of a much longer historical process. Political consolidation continued for generations after Fairhair's lifetime. Still, his legacy proved enormous. Many Norwegian chieftains, unwilling to accept increasing loyal authority, reportedly sought greater independence overseas. Later Icelandic tradition attributes much of Iceland's settlement to these immigrants, though historians recognize that economic opportunity also played an important role. Whether every family departed for political reasons cannot be determined. The stories nevertheless preserve an important truth. The strengthening of royal power encouraged some individuals to seek freedom elsewhere. Norwegian kingship remained unstable throughout much of the Viking Age. Rival claimants frequently competed for the throne, while regional jarls retained considerable influence. Yet over time, successive rulers gradually extended royal authority farther along the coastline. Among the most significant was Olaf Tryggvason. After years spent abroad as a Viking warrior and merchant, Olaf seized the Norwegian throne in 995. His reign lasted only 5 years, ending with defeat at the naval battle of Svolder around the year 1000. Despite its brevity, his rule left a lasting mark. Olaf vigorously promoted Christianity, often deploying methods considerably harsher than those favored elsewhere in Europe. Medieval sources describe local leaders being pressured, threatened, or compelled to accept baptism. Some accounts undoubtedly exaggerate these episodes, but there is little doubt that Olaf viewed religious conversion as an essential component of political unity. His successor in historical importance was Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf. He ruled from 1015 until his death at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Although he fell in battle against political rivals, his subsequent reputation transformed Norwegian history. His cult spread rapidly after reports of miracles associated with his tomb, helping strengthen both Christianity and royal legitimacy throughout the kingdom. Sweden followed a somewhat different course. Its political development remains more difficult to reconstruct because contemporary written sources are comparatively limited. Unlike Norway, Sweden maintained particularly strong commercial connections with the Baltic and Eastern Europe. Many of the merchants and warriors who had traveled the river routes toward Novgorod, Kiev, and Constantinople originated from eastern Sweden. These eastern connections brought immense wealth while exposing Swedish elites to foreign political models and religious influences. One early ruler remembered in later tradition is Eric the Victorious. His son, Olaf Skotkonung, became especially significant. Generally regarded as Sweden's first Christian king, Olaf issued some of the earliest Swedish coins while strengthening royal authority during the opening years of the 11th century. Like Denmark and Norway, Sweden's conversion unfolded gradually. Traditional Norse religious practices continued in many regions for generations, particularly important cult centers such as Uppsala. Throughout Scandinavia, Jarls continued to occupy influential positions beneath the king. The title generally referred to powerful regional nobles responsible for governing large territories, leading military expeditions, collecting tribute, and advising the monarch. Their relationship with kings remained complicated. Strong rulers relied upon capable Jarls to administer distant provinces. Weak rulers often found ambitious Jarls behaving almost as independent princes. Political authority therefore rested upon constant negotiation. Marriage formed another important tool of diplomacy. Royal families established allegiances by arranging marriages with neighboring kingdoms, influential Scandinavian dynasties, and occasionally foreign rulers. These unions helped secure peace, strengthen claims to territory, and expand political influence without warfare. Genealogy became a form of politics. Tracing descent from respected ancestors enhanced legitimacy, while poets preserved dynastic histories through carefully composed verses recited before royal courts. The Skalds occupied an important place within this political world. Far more than entertainers, these poets commemorated victories, celebrated rulers, recorded genealogies, and preserved historical memory. Their compositions served as both literature and political messaging, reinforcing the reputation of kings before audiences who expected generosity in return. Royal courts reflected growing sophistication. Kings surrounded themselves with advisors, warriors, craftsmen, merchants, and clergy as Christianity spread. Feasting halls became centers not only of hospitality, but of administration, diplomacy, and judicial authority. The economy supported this increasing complexity. Trade generated reliable sources of wealth beyond seasonal raiding alone. Taxes and tribute gradually supplemented gift-giving as mechanisms for maintaining royal authority. Coinage appeared more frequently, particularly in Denmark and Sweden, reflecting greater economic integration with the rest of Europe. Even architecture changed. Large royal estates, fortified settlements, churches, bridges, and roads required planning on a scale unimaginable to earlier generations of local chieftains. Yet despite these developments, Scandinavian kings remained far from absolute monarchs. They still depended heavily upon the support of regional elites. Assemblies continued exercising considerable influence, and rulers ignored traditional law at their peril. The balance between centralized authority and local independence remained one of the defining characteristics of Viking politics. By the beginning of the 11th century, however, the transformation was unmistakable. The Scandinavia that had launched the first raids on Lindisfarne consisted largely of competing regional leaders bound together through personal loyalty. The Scandinavia now emerging possessed recognizable kingdoms with expanding administrations, established dynasties, growing Christian institutions, and rulers whose ambitions extended far beyond their own coastlines. These kingdoms would soon play a prominent role in European affairs. Some kings dreamed not merely of ruling Denmark, Norway, or Sweden, but of governing vast empires stretching across the North Sea itself. Others sought legitimacy through a new religion that was gradually replacing the ancient gods who had guided Scandinavian life for centuries. The political map of the North had begun to stabilize. The spiritual landscape, however, was about to experience a transformation every bit as profound. In the generations ahead, the old stories of Odin, Thor, Freya, and the great ash tree Yggdrasil would increasingly share the Scandinavian world with churches, bishops, and Christian kings, marking the beginning of one of the most significant cultural changes of the entire Viking Age. Every society seeks to understand the world around it. For the people of Viking Age Scandinavia, the changing seasons, violent storms, successful harvests, unexpected illness, and fortunes of war all reflected a universe inhabited by powerful supernatural beings. Their religion offered explanations for the forces that shaped everyday life, while providing stories that connected ordinary people to a cosmos far larger than themselves. Unlike Christianity or Islam, Norse religion possessed no single sacred book. There was no central religious authority, no universally accepted body of doctrine, and no institution capable of enforcing theological agreement across Scandinavia. Beliefs developed gradually through oral tradition, local customs, and shared stories passed from one generation to the next. This makes reconstructing Viking religion a fascinating challenge. The Scandinavians themselves left almost no written description of their beliefs before converting to Christianity. Much of what survives comes from sources written centuries later, particularly in medieval Iceland, where Christian scholars preserved ancient poems and myths that might otherwise have disappeared forever. The two most important literary collections are known today as the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. The Poetic Edda preserves older mythological and heroic poems, whose origins likely stretch back into the Viking Age itself. The Prose Edda, written during the early 13th century by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson, explains many myths while serving as a handbook for poets. These works remain invaluable, yet historians approach them carefully. They were written after Scandinavia had become Christian, meaning they preserve traditions through the perspective of authors living in a very different religious world. Archaeology, place names, foreign chronicles, and contemporary evidence therefore play equally important roles in understanding Norse belief. Despite these limitations, certain themes emerge with remarkable consistency. At the center of Norse cosmology stood an immense ash tree known as Yggdrasil. Its branches stretched across the heavens, while its roots reached deep into the foundations of existence itself. Rather than existing merely as a symbolic image, Yggdrasil formed the structure upon which the universe rested. The gods held councils beneath its branches. Creatures inhabited its trunk and roots. The tree connected different realms occupied by gods, giants, humans, and the dead, making it the great axis around which the cosmos revolved. The Norse imagined the universe as a collection of interconnected worlds. Among them was Asgard, the home of many gods. Midgard served as the realm of humanity, surrounded by the great ocean where the enormous world serpent Jormungandr encircled the earth. Jotunheim lay beyond, inhabited by the giants, powerful beings who frequently opposed the gods, while also intermarrying with them. Other realms included Vanaheim, home of another family of gods, Alfheim, associated with the elves, Svartalfheim, linked to skilled dwarven craftsmen, Muspelheim, the realm of fire, Niflheim, associated with cold and mist, and Hel, the domain ruled by the goddess of the same name. These worlds were not entirely separate. Travel between them occurred throughout Norse mythology, though often only with great difficulty or through supernatural means. Among the gods themselves, none possessed greater complexity than Odin. He ruled as the chief of the Aesir, one of the principal families of Norse deities. Yet Odin differed greatly from the image of an all-powerful creator familiar in later monotheistic religions. He hungered constantly for knowledge. According to tradition, Odin sacrificed one of his own eyes in exchange for wisdom from Mimir's well. In another famous myth, he hung himself upon Yggdrasil for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, in order to discover the secret knowledge of the runes. These sacrifices reflected an important theme. Wisdom required a price. Odin embodied many different qualities at once. He presided over kingship, poetry, battle, magic, prophecy, and death. Warriors hoped to earn his favor before entering combat, while poets sought inspiration from the same god who delighted in hidden knowledge and subtle understanding. His companions reflected his broad interests. 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names mean thought and memory, flew across the world each day before returning to whisper everything they had witnessed into Odin's ear. 2 wolves accompanied him as well. Every aspect of his mythology emphasized observation, intelligence, and the pursuit of understanding. If Odin represented wisdom, Thor represented strength. By far the most popular god among ordinary Scandinavians, Thor served as humanity's protector against the forces of chaos. He wielded the mighty hammer Mjolnir, one of the most famous weapons in world mythology. Forged by dwarven craftsmen, Mjolnir always returned to Thor's hand after being thrown. Its power protected both gods and humans from dangerous enemies, particularly the giants who threatened cosmic order. Thor traveled across the heavens in a chariot drawn by 2 goats. The sound of thunder reflected the passage of his wheels across the sky. Unlike Odin, who often relied upon cunning and hidden knowledge, Thor confronted danger directly. His myths frequently depict him battling giants, defending sacred places, and preserving the balance upon which the world depended. Archaeology confirms his immense popularity. Thousands of small hammer-shaped pendants have been discovered throughout Scandinavia. Many date to the period when Christianity began spreading across the north, suggesting that wearing Thor's hammer may have expressed both religious devotion and cultural identity during a time of significant change. Freya occupied another central place within Norse belief. She belonged originally to the Vanir, another family of gods associated with fertility, prosperity, and peace, before joining the Aesir following a mythical conflict between the 2 groups. Freya governed love, beauty, fertility, and magic. Yet she also possessed a martial aspect often overlooked in modern retellings. According to Norse tradition, she received half of those who died honorably in battle, while Odin welcomed the other half into Valhalla. Her hall, Folkvangir, therefore stood alongside Odin's as one of the principal destinations awaiting fallen warriors. Her brother Freyr likewise held great importance. Associated with fertility, successful harvests, prosperity, and peace, Freyr reflected the agricultural foundations of Scandinavian life. Farmers sought his favor for abundant crops and healthy livestock, demonstrating that Viking religion remained deeply connected to everyday survival rather than warfare alone. Another unforgettable figure appears throughout Norse mythology: Loki. Modern audiences often imagine him simply as a villain, largely because of later adaptations in popular culture. The original myths present a far more complicated character. Loki possessed extraordinary intelligence and remarkable talent for deception. At times, he assisted the gods, solving problems through cleverness that no one else could match. On other occasions, he created disasters, requiring equally ingenious solutions. His unpredictable nature made him indispensable and dangerous in equal measure. Many of the greatest treasures possessed by the gods, including Thor's hammer and Odin's spear Gungnir, came into existence because Loki first caused trouble that needed correcting. His story eventually leads towards one of Norse mythology's defining events, Ragnarok. Often translated as the fate of the gods, Ragnarok describes the prophesied destruction and renewal of the world. According to the surviving myths, signs of the coming catastrophe include years of bitter winter, known as the Fimbulwinter, widespread warfare among humanity, and the breaking of ancient cosmic bonds. Loki escapes imprisonment. Fenrir the monstrous wolf breaks free. Jormungandr rises from the sea. The giants march toward Asgard. The final battle destroys much of the cosmos. Thor kills the world serpent but dies from its venom. Odin falls before Fenrir. Freyr is slain by the fire giant Surtur. The world itself disappears beneath flames and floodwaters. Yet Ragnarok does not end with annihilation. A renewed earth rises from the sea. Some gods survive, others return. Two human beings emerge to begin life anew beneath a cleansed sky. The myth, therefore, describes not merely destruction but renewal, reflecting the cyclical understanding of nature familiar to agricultural societies, where every winter eventually gives way to spring. Religion during the Viking Age extended far beyond mythology. It shaped everyday practice. People sought divine favor through sacrifice. Animals such as horses, pigs, cattle, or sheep might be offered during important festivals. Food and drink formed part of communal feasts honoring the gods. Valuable weapons, jewelry, and tools were sometimes deposited intentionally within lakes, rivers, bogs, or marshes. The religious world of the Vikings therefore combined mythology, ritual, seasonal celebration, political authority, and everyday necessity into a single interconnected system. The gods explained natural forces, guided rulers, protected families, inspired poets, and accompanied warriors into battle. Their stories were told beside hearth fires during long northern winters, while their symbols adorned weapons, jewelry, ships, and homes throughout Scandinavia. For centuries, these beliefs helped define the identity of the Norse world. Yet change had already begun. Christian missionaries, foreign merchants, and newly ambitious kings were introducing another faith into Scandinavia, one that offered different answers to the same enduring questions about life, death, and humanity's place within the universe. The Viking Age had not yet ended. Its final chapter, however, was already beginning to unfold. When the first Viking ships appeared off the coast of Lindisfarne in 793, the people aboard followed the old gods of Scandinavia. They wore Thor's hammer around their necks, offered sacrifices to Odin and Freyr, gathered at sacred groves and assemblies, and measured the passing of the seasons according to traditions inherited from generations long before the arrival of Christianity in the north. 3 centuries later, the world they had known had changed almost beyond recognition. Stone churches stood where pagan temples and sacred groves had once drawn worshippers. Bishops advised kings. Monasteries appeared across Scandinavia. Children received Christian baptism rather than being dedicated through older customs. And the rulers of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden understood themselves as members of Christian Europe rather than outsiders looking toward its wealthy shores. The Viking Age did not end with a single battle. nor did Christianity replace Norse religion in a single generation. Transformation unfolded gradually over several centuries through trade, diplomacy, royal ambition, missionary work, and the quiet decisions made by countless ordinary families. The first Christians had probably arrived in Scandinavia long before the conversion of its kings. Merchants traveling between Denmark and the Frankish Empire encountered Christian communities regularly. Scandinavian traders visiting England, Ireland, and the Byzantine Empire witnessed churches, monasteries, and public worship wherever they traveled. Some undoubtedly returned home carrying more than foreign goods. Christian captives also entered Scandinavia. Many people seized during Viking raids remained enslaved within Norse households. Among them were priests, monks, nuns, and lay Christians whose beliefs continued even in captivity. Although little direct evidence survives describing these interactions, historians generally believe they contributed to Christianity's slow introduction into northern society. Missionaries followed soon afterward. One of the earliest and most important was Ansgar. Born around the beginning of the 9th century within the Frankish Empire, Ansgar became deeply committed to spreading Christianity beyond its established frontiers. Supported by the Carolingian rulers and later recognized as the Apostle of the North, he undertook several missions to Scandinavia. His first major journey brought him to Birka in Sweden during the 820s. The mission achieved modest success. A small Christian community emerged, though traditional Norse religion remained firmly established. Churches founded during this period often struggled to survive once missionary support disappeared. Conversion proved uneven, with periods of progress followed by setbacks as political circumstances changed. Ansgar's work, nevertheless, established lasting connections. Rather than relying solely upon dramatic public preaching, missionaries cultivated relationships with local rulers, whose support could protect emerging Christian communities. This strategy reflected political reality. In Viking Age Scandinavia, the ruler's religion carried enormous influence. A king who embraced Christianity gained valuable diplomatic advantages. Christian kingdoms elsewhere in Europe increasingly regarded baptized rulers as legitimate partners for alliance, trade, and marriage. Conversion therefore served political as well as spiritual purposes. Denmark provides one of the clearest examples. As previously discussed, Harald Bluetooth ruled during the second half of the 10th century. The reasons for his conversion probably combined sincere religious conviction with practical statecraft. Christianity strengthened relationships with the Holy Roman Empire while helping Harald consolidate royal authority over competing regional leaders. The famous Jelling Stone commemorates this achievement. The inscription proudly declares that Harald made the Danes Christian. The statement captures an important aspiration. The reality proved considerably more gradual. Ordinary people did not abandon long-established beliefs overnight. Archaeological evidence reveals pagan and Christian customs existing side by side for generations. Some graves contain Christian symbols alongside objects reflecting older traditions. Others suggest families adapting familiar funeral practices while embracing new religious ideas. The transition rarely followed a straight line. Many Scandinavians may have viewed Christianity at first as an additional source of divine power, rather than an exclusive replacement for existing beliefs. religious boundaries remained surprisingly flexible. A merchant preparing for a dangerous voyage might wear Thor's hammer while also seeking the blessing of a Christian priest encountered abroad. Such combinations seem contradictory from a modern perspective, but probably reflected the practical outlook of communities accustomed to incorporating useful traditions from many sources. Norway's conversion unfolded under more dramatic circumstances. One of the earliest Christian kings was Hakon the Good. Raised partly in England under Christian influence, Hakon attempted to encourage the new faith after becoming king during the middle of the 10th century. His efforts met determined resistance. Many influential chieftains remained devoted to traditional religious practices. Medieval accounts describe Hakon participating reluctantly in pagan sacrifices to preserve political support, illustrating the difficult balance facing rulers during this transitional period. His successors adopted firmer methods. Olaf Tyrgvason returned to Norway in 995, after years spent abroad as a Viking leader. A committed Christian, he sought to accelerate conversion with remarkable determination. The medieval sagas portray Olaf traveling throughout Norway, demanding baptism from local rulers and communities. Those who resisted supposedly faced threats, confiscation of property, exile, or execution. Most historians recognize that these accounts probably exaggerate certain episodes. Saga authors often emphasized dramatic confrontations that reflected broader themes rather than precise historical reporting. Even so, there is little doubt that Olaf viewed Christianity as an essential instrument of political unity. His reign lasted only until the Battle of Svolder around the year 1000. The work of conversion continued under Olaf Haraldsson. Later known as Saint Olaf, he ruled Norway between 1015 and 1028, before briefly losing his throne. Attempting to regain power, he confronted his opponents at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. There, he was killed. His political defeat unexpectedly became a religious triumph. Reports of miracles associated with Olaf's burial spread rapidly. He was canonized as a saint, and his shrine at Nidaros, present-day Trondheim, developed into one of medieval Scandinavia's most important pilgrimage destinations. The cult of Saint Olaf strengthened Christianity throughout Norway. It also reinforced the growing connection between religious authority and royal legitimacy. Kings increasingly presented themselves as God's representatives, responsible for protecting both church and kingdom. Sweden experienced perhaps the slowest conversion. Traditional religious centers remained influential well into the 11th century. The great sanctuary at Uppsala, associated with sacrifices to Odin, Thor, and Freyr, retained considerable prestige even as Christianity spread elsewhere. Pagan and Christian communities coexisted for generations, with different regions adopting the new faith at different rates. King Olof Skotkonung became the first Swedish ruler known to have accepted Christian baptism. His reign, around the beginning of the 11th century, marked an important milestone, though many of his subjects continued practicing older traditions long afterward. Eventually, bishops, churches, monasteries, and Christian law established firmer foundations across Sweden as well. Conversion transformed Scandinavian society in countless ways. Churches gradually replaced sacred groves as centers of worship. Stone buildings appeared alongside traditional wood architecture. Monasteries introduced literacy on a broader scale, preserving religious texts while contributing to administration and education. Writing itself became more common. Runes continued in use for memorial stones and everyday inscriptions, but the Latin alphabet accompanied Christianity into Scandinavia. Kings, bishops, and monasteries relied upon written records rather than exclusively oral tradition. Law also evolved. Earlier legal assemblies remained remarkably resilient. The Thing continued operating throughout Scandinavia, though many legal codes gradually incorporated Christian principles regarding marriage, inheritance, feast days, and criminal punishment. The Church discouraged practices associated with older religion. Animal sacrifice, certain burial customs, and public pagan ceremonies gradually disappeared or survived only in remote districts. Many seasonal celebrations, however, proved surprisingly adaptable. Traditional winter festivals blended with Christmas observances, while older agricultural customs found new expression within the Christian calendar. The change was often evolutionary rather than revolutionary. As Christianity spread across Scandinavia, Viking expeditions themselves also changed. Raiding never disappeared entirely. Christian rulers occasionally fought one another with every bit as much determination as their pagan predecessors. Yet the character of Scandinavian expansion shifted noticeably. Kings pursued stable government instead of seasonal plunder. Trade generated wealth more reliably than raiding. Foreign alliances depended upon diplomacy rather than intimidation alone. The kingdoms of Scandinavia became integrated members of medieval Europe. One ruler embodied this transformation more completely than any other: Canute the Great. The son of the Danish king Sven Forkbeard, Canute inherited enormous ambitions. Following years of campaigning, he secured the English throne in 1016 after defeating Edmund Ironside. His empire eventually encompassed England, Denmark, Norway, and portions of southern Sweden, creating what historians often call the North Sea Empire. Unlike earlier Viking leaders, remembered primarily for raids, Canute ruled as a Christian monarch. He supported churches generously, maintained close relationships with bishops, issued written laws, and presented himself as the legitimate heir to both Scandinavian and English traditions. His government illustrates how profoundly the Viking world had changed. The descendants of pagan raiders now governed established kingdoms using institutions recognizable across Christian Europe. The North Sea Empire did not survive long after Canute's death in 1035. His successors struggled to maintain control over its diverse territories, and the political union gradually dissolved. Even so, Canute's reign demonstrated what Scandinavian rulers had become capable of achieving. The final symbolic moment of the Viking Age arrived in 1066. Its central figure was Harald Hardrada, often translated as Harald Hard Ruler or Hard Council. He possessed one of the most extraordinary careers of any Viking king. As a young man, Harald fled Norway after the Battle of Stiklestad. He entered service with the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, fought across the Byzantine Empire, accumulated immense wealth, and eventually returned to Scandinavia to claim the Norwegian throne. By the middle of the 11th century, he had established himself as one of Europe's most formidable rulers. Following the death of King Edward the Confessor of England in January 1066, Harald asserted his own claim to the English throne. Supporting him was Tosti Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's new king, Harold Godwinson. Harald assembled a large invasion fleet. Crossing the North Sea, he won an initial victory at the Battle of Fulford near York in September 1066. The triumph, however, proved short-lived. Only 5 days later, Harold Godwinson marched his army north with remarkable speed. Two forces met at Stamford Bridge on 25 September 1066. The battle became one of the most famous engagements of medieval history. Caught largely by surprise, and with many of his men lacking armor, after expecting negotiations rather than immediate combat, Harold fought fiercely. But he was killed during the fighting, reportedly struck by an arrow in the throat. His army collapsed. The survivors retreated to Norway with only a fraction of the ships that had carried them to England. Historians often regard Stamford Bridge as the traditional end of the Viking Age. The choice is partly symbolic. Scandinavian raids continued occasionally afterward, and Norse culture certainly did not disappear overnight. Yet, Harald Hardrada's defeat marked the last major attempt by a Scandinavian king to conquer England through the methods that had defined earlier centuries of Viking expansion. Only weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself fell at the Battle of Hastings before William, Duke of Normandy. Ironically, William's ancestors had also been Vikings. The Duchy of Normandy had originated when the Viking leader Rollo received land from the Frankish king in 911. Within a few generations, Rollo's descendants had adopted the French language, Christianity, and much of Frankish culture. The conqueror who defeated England in 1066 therefore carried Scandinavian ancestry, even though he no longer considered himself a Viking. By the late 11th century, the world that had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne had passed into history. The old gods had largely given way to Christianity. Independent chieftains had become kings. Seasonal raiders had evolved into rulers of established kingdoms. Scandinavia itself now stood firmly within the political, religious, and cultural framework of medieval Europe. The Viking Age had reached its conclusion. Its influence, however, remains woven into the history of Europe, carried forward in language, law, exploration, trade, and memory. And so, as the long northern twilight settles over the fjords and the sea grows quiet once more, the story of the Vikings comes to a rest. Not as a tale of endless conquest, but as the history of a people whose curiosity, resilience, and remarkable skill at navigating both water and change carried them farther than they could have ever imagined, leaving a legacy that still reaches across the centuries today.